So can everyone see my screen? Yes? Is good? Yes. Okay, great. Okay. Hi, my name's Hannah. As was just mentioned, I've done a lot of things, but I'm talking to you today because I'm the director of the National Forest Gardening Scheme, one of the directors. I'm trying to change the slide. So a little bit about us. We are a members organisation. We're interested in promoting forest gardens, forest gardeners and forest gardening, and we try to facilitate learning and advocate for spreading the ideas of forest garden planting and techniques. So what is a forest garden? This is a quote from Martin Crawford, who's probably one of the most recognised people in the forest gardening movement. So he says, a forest garden is modelled on the structure of a young natural woodland, utilising plants of direct and indirect benefits to people, often edible plants. This is a good description, but I think it's a little bit limited. So I've also chosen to include this one from Thomas Ramirez, who's, again, quite a recognised figure within the movement, who says, a forest garden is a place where people and nature meet halfway, between the canopy of the trees and the soil underfoot. It doesn't have to look like a forest. What's important is that the natural processes are allowed to unfold to the benefit of plants, people, and other creatures. The result is an edible ecosystem. So I think this captures better the way I feel about forest gardening, which is that when you engage in it, you're really engaging in taking your place as part of a local ecosystem, and you will be stewarding that and tending it and creating and designing within that, but you're really gardening with nature instead of trying to control it. This is a quite well-known image. This is actually by, I think, Graham Bernadette, but it illustrates, so the founder of the modern forest garden movement who brought it over to the UK is Robert Hart. He brought the techniques over. They originated from tropical countries and Africa, where they plant in guilds, and he adapted them for the temperate climate. And he identified 7 layers for a forest garden. But this is a good frame to start with, but it's worth bearing in mind that in a smaller space, you might use less than 7 layers. And some people say that you can actually have more. But this gives you the basic structure. So you've got a canopy layer, you've got a lower canopy layer, you've got shrubs, you've got ground cover that's ensuring the soil isn't bare, which is very important for soil health, as I'll talk about later. And then you might have climbers, vertical layers, climbers going up trees and things like that. So you're really making the most advantage of your 3-dimensional space, as in a forest. So if you're thinking about designing a forest ecosystem, what dimensions do you think you'd need to consider? So this is actually a question which I wanted to get people who are listening to think about. So I've just talked about one of them, which is space, 3-dimensional space. But can anyone think of, or does anyone want to put in the chat, some other dimensions that you might consider if you were going to try to design an ecosystem that would be productive or self-sustaining? I don't know whether you can. I don't know if I can see the chat. Can I see the chat? Maybe. I don't know if anyone actually has. Time. Yes, time is good. Lighting. Yeah, so where the sun is. Yeah, definitely. Light and air circulation. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, yeah. So I'll come back to this. Water. Very good. Yeah. Water, moisture. Definitely. So I've got the chat up there, which is why I'm looking up. So you've touched on some of these things. So you've got time. So both over the year and someone's just put it in, timing of plants production. So yeah, that's both over the year, but over successions. So for example, if you're going to plant a tree, you might be like, right, I'm planting a tree. It's going to take, say, 5 to 10 years to get larger. In that time, I can have shrubs around it. In 5 to 10 years, those shrubs might not be alive anymore, but the tree will then be too big and it would shade them out. So you can design both in like micro time, so over a year, and macro time, so life cycle of plants. Thinking about diversity, we've already talked about structural diversity, but you might also think about biodiversity, wildlife habitats. You want to think about functional diversity, which is thinking about what do different plants bring to the ecosystem? What functions are they fulfilling? And one of them might be nutrient flows, which is what I've put here as well. So in a forest garden, we're often planting perennially, which I'll talk about a bit more later. So in that case, you really want to think about how are nutrients moving in and out of that system, and plants can help us to do that. Nitrogen fixers, potentially dynamic accumulators, although that's a little bit contentious because they do have big tap roots and they draw nutrients up, but like comfrey. But unless you cut the leaves off and process them through a compost tea, then it won't necessarily get in soil. Anyway, if you're doing a publicly accessible garden, then you might also think about social flows. So where are people already moving through the space? But also, how are you going to engage people? How are you going to engage people over time? And then water, which we already touched on. And there's probably loads more, but those are just some examples. So considering functions. So as I said, if we're designing like an ecosystem, we want to think about, in a natural ecosystem, it doesn't need any tending. All of the different plants and animals are cycling nutrients, moving things around. They are doing all that themselves. When we start messing with that, we can disrupt those, and then we have to fulfill some of those functions. But if we're designing an ecosystem to begin with, we can think about where the nutrients coming and try to design something that can almost be self-maintaining. So as I mentioned earlier, we tend to think about that in terms of guilds. So a guild of plants that will grow together in a complementary way. I don't know loads about guilds. There's a recommendation on this slide for a recording of a whole session about guilds that we recorded last summer. But I'll just quickly talk you through this one. So as an example, so this one has an apple tree, that's the canopy layer, that's going to be providing shade, potentially shelter from the wind, as well as edible crop in the form of apples and habitat for birds or wildlife. Below that, you've got your shrub bush layer. So here you've got Rosa rugosa, which is the type of rose hip. So that's again providing good habitat for wildlife, as well as berries for birds, but also for humans. I personally find rose hips a little bit of a faff, but they are quite tasty. So below that, you've got your climbing nasturtium. So in the picture, you probably saw that it could be climbing up a tree or climbing up another plant, but here you can see they've got it climbing up the wall. Nasturtiums are great because they attract pollinators again, but they also can repel some pests, and they're a self-seeding annual. So although often we plant with perennials, in this case, a self-seeding annual might be useful because when it dies, if you leave the organic matter on the plot, or you might even cut it down and put it down as a green mulch, as it breaks down, it will actually cycle nutrients into the soil. So that's quite useful. And then finally, the ground cover. So wild garlic, as you've probably seen in forests, it can grow very prolifically, cover the ground, protect the soil, stop it from being exposed to the elements and the getting broken down, which is less of a problem in this country, but it's still worthwhile. And of course, wild garlic is tasty to eat, and it can, again, help with detracting pests. Sweet cicely, I actually don't know specifically its functions in the ecosystem, but I do know that it is a very good sweetener for diabetics. And this particular guild with Forest of Hearts was being planted in a hospital. So it may have been included because of that. And there might be another reason, but I don't know what it is, sorry. So that might seem quite complex. If you Google guilds, forest garden guilds, you'll find loads of lists of functions in different plants that fulfill them, and which is quite useful. And from the National Forest Gardening Scheme, we've actually come up with a series of guilds which are designed for different spaces. You can access them on our website. There's drawings, there's the list of plants. So if you're trying to get started with it, you can start there. And if you see the guilds that we've got there, you can see which plants are fulfilling different functions, and you can swap in ones that are more desirable or appropriate for yourself. Yeah, so that's one resource, might help. And if you do it, please write to us, because we want to make these guilds better. So we'd love to know if it worked or didn't work, or if you swapped things in and out, so that we can put that information on our website as well and keep cycling the knowledge further. Right, so some key things about forest gardening. We've already mentioned no dig or low dig. So perennial planting, that means you don't have to disturb the soil very often, which is great for soil health. When you're planting in this way, it can also be useful to establish paths, because compaction, so stepping on the soil, can also be bad, not great for the soil ecology. So yeah, no or low dig helps it to be low maintenance as well. So yeah, soil health. Maybe a lot of you already know this, so I'm just, but I'll say it just in case. People used to often think of soil as dirt, kind of inert matter, but actually I think more and more now everybody is realizing that soil is teeming with life, and actually for plants to be able to get the nutrients, it's essential that you have the soil food web, the soil ecology. It's what actually breaks down the organic matter and makes it available to the plants, especially things, for example, mycorrhiza fungi is essential for plants to access phosphorus. It's also essential for soil structure, because the different exudates that are produced by the bacteria or protozoa contribute to the clumping of soil, where it's able to then hold nutrients and moisture. Yeah, if you're interested in this, I recommend this book, Teeming with Microbes. It's very in-depth, but it's very accessible. So yeah, definitely recommend that. Forest gardens have multiple benefits. So I've already touched on the low maintenance. It's definitely worth noting that during the establishing years, it's not necessarily low maintenance, because you'll be experimenting, changing, planting, and so it might not be, but they are very low maintenance once established, or they can be. They're good for biodiversity, because for biodiversity, it's actually quite important to have structural complexity, because it provides a lot of different habitats and forage. And again, with the perennial nature of the forest garden, that also supports biodiversity, because you have plants that are being less messed with, I suppose. So the ecology can establish. And health and well-being, which you talked about last week, but I thought I'd mention it because this week is Mental Health Awareness Week. And as with other gardens and green spaces, forest gardens are great for connecting with nature, connecting with your local ecology, which is very good for mental health and well-being. They're also suitable for diverse spaces. So this is probably one of the most famous forest gardens in the UK. You can go and visit it, Martin Crawford's Forest Garden. It's in Devon, near Schumacher College. If you do want to go and visit it, you have to get in there, because the tours tend to book up very quickly at the beginning of the year. But yeah, it's a 2.5 acre field that's been converted into an edible paradise. In fact, not all of the plants are native, but there are lots of delicious and surprising things, so I recommend visiting. This is something that might be more familiar to other people, to some people, which is a park. So this is Birchfield's park, where they've got a forest garden which is planted in 4 quadrants around the edge of one section of the park. This is one of the quadrants. So yeah, bringing a lot of edible harvests for both wildlife and for people to the park. Here's a forest garden that's been put in a garden. So you can see here, as was described at the beginning, a forest garden doesn't have to look like a forest. You can apply the same principles into very different spaces. So in this case, in a garden, you can probably see that there is still structural complexity. So you've got different patches, both horizontally as well as vertically. You've got flowers. There's probably lots of different edible herbs and things going on there. But yeah, so that's an example. Like, you don't need a 2.5 acre field to apply forest gardening techniques to your growing. And this is, I quite like this, because this demonstrates as well, this is the design for the forest garden, which is in Stratford upon Avon Hospital. So the forest garden elements are actually just around the edge of the space. And I've seen this quite often in community gardens, where they'll tend to have a forest garden patch or area where they've applied these techniques around the edge of the space. And here, this is also because in the hospital, an important function of the space was actually to provide a respite place for patients and for doctors. So the center of the space is dominated by leaving space for the social element. I don't know if anyone here knows about permaculture zoning, but if you were designing your garden in a permaculture way, then forest gardens are normally in the zone 3 to 5. Zoning is based around, so you analyze your site, where people actually move around the site currently. So zone 0 is going to be where you are all the time, like your house. Zone 1 will be maybe like where you walk out of your house down the drive. Your zone 2 might be the garden, but close by to the house. And then you situate your plants and your planting design according to what needs more or less maintenance and where you are in the space normally. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah. So forest gardens, being quite low maintenance, can generally be in the 3 to 5, so on the edge of your community garden or garden. I've just given you loads of information. So how can you apply this? The National Forest Gardening Scheme has come up with some principles to help guide people to apply these designs to their own spaces. So you've got diversity, which I've talked about all these things, biodiversity, structural diversity, functional diversity of location. We've included observe and interact, which is also a permaculture principle, but it's very important when you first arrive at a site to spend a year, maybe like growing annual plants or just getting to know the site, because there'll be so many different microclimates across the site. There'll be bits where the soil is more poor. There'll be bits where the light comes at different times of year, or where there's more or less moisture. And once you start doing things like buying trees and planting a tree, which is going to be there for, 20 plus years, you really want to be sure about where you're situating all those things. Using minimum effort, working with the ecosystem, planting perennially so that you don't have to be tending as much. That relates to the next one, which is using resources responsibly and efficiently. So can you engage with plants to cycle nutrients rather than using fertilizers, which I know Communigrow already do? Can you capture rainwater and move that around the site rather than bringing in water from a tap? I know one forest garden, I think Rakesh Rootsman, who's a permaculture teacher, he actually designed one forest garden where he had water coming from a sink inside the house. So some of the water from the sinks inside the house, or one specific sink, was being diverted to a soakaway at the edge of the garden, which made the garden fairly self-sufficient in terms of water. So you can think about those kind of things. Of course, at the National Forest Gardening Scheme, we're thinking about public forest gardens. So the next one, in deciding your group structure together, this is about, thinking about cultivating your forest garden group and the social part of your forest garden as much as cultivating the garden, taking care of that, working with consensus or democratic decision making, and being aware of that. Looking beyond the edge, again, very important for public forest gardens. Who are the people around your space? How are they interacting with it? How are you going to engage them with it? But even if you don't have, even if it's not a public facing forest garden, your neighbors, the people who are around, it's important to situate and think about where is your forest garden in a wider context, and how are you going to ensure it's interacting with that well. Then the final one of these principles is learning, so celebrating. So if you're going to garden with nature, you have to, as all gardeners do anyway, but you need to embrace a uncertainty and a learning mindset, because things just don't always go as you expect, and you have to just be ready to learn and to work with it. And celebrating, because it's important to make it as fun as possible all the time. Celebrating change of season, things going right, everything, all the things. So book recommendations. I like these books. I don't know if you would need to have all of them, but if you're just thinking about starting out, at least one of them would probably be very useful. And also on the National Forest Gardening Scheme website, we have loads of resources, a map where you can find forest gardens to visit for inspiration. We've got recordings from our seminar series. We've got principles, loads of resources, including, we also have a supplementary planning document, which if you're a campaigning kind of person, can be very useful. Like the supplementary planning document, which was adopted by Brighton and Hove related to community gardening, I think it resulted in like at least 17% of new developments, including space for community growing. So it can be very useful to engage with planning in this way. Anyway, that's diverging. But yeah, so please do check out our website. We've got free seminars and recordings there. And thanks for the talk.